Welcome to The Nation. I'm Jessie CHAHAL. Now, the United States recently announced a sweeping 24% tariff on certain goods from Malaysia. That's part of a broader move targeting multiple countries amid rising trade tensions and global realignments. Well, what does this mean for Malaysia's economic resilience and its trade relationships, as well as diplomatic positioning, especially since we are chair this year? Well, to unpack these complex issues, we're joined today by two distinguished gentlemen. Firstly, Dr. A.T.KUMARARAJAH, Vice President of the National Chamber of Commerce and Industry of Malaysia, as well as Professor BENG, Professor of ASEAN Studies at the International Islamic University of Malaysia, to share their deep insights into what's happening regionally in terms of geopolitics and diplomacy. Welcome, gentlemen. It's good to have you in the studio. The Prime Minister has said, in not so many words as well, that we're not at a point of crisis. It is at a point of a crossroad, perhaps, and that he assures that the nation will weather this challenge from a position of strength. In other words, that we will adapt. Prof, what was your initial reaction upon hearing the 24% tariff that has been put on Malaysia?
Empirically, the Prime Minister is spot on. Dato Sri Anwar is completely correct on his assessment. The reason is because a day after the taxation of 24% was imposed by President Donald Trump, it was also announced that all our semiconductors, integrated circuits and chips would be exempted from any kinds of taxation at all. So we are completely exempted from that. And if we were to look at the bilateral relationship, trade relationship between United States and Malaysia, 67% of our relationship is actually composed or comprised of those items, electrical and electronics. So when you have such a substantial number of items that are exempted from that onerous tax of 24%, it's actually a lifesaver. So in that sense, we have been very, very fortunate.
So we've been blessed amidst all of this talk and announcement and what might say some a confusion. But A.T., would you say that your initial reaction to this was something that Malaysia anticipated, or were you surprised?
No, I personally, I would have thought this is something which is already in the cards, right? So this was just being worked up. Would it have been so widespread? My logic was, wow, he's really done it, because it was quite obvious that he was going to do this to China at some point in time, right? So he built up this whole narrative from the time he got sworn in. But I think they've just taken this to the next level. To me, it's a complete hard reset. To argue this from an American standpoint, I suppose it is justified. You probably, everybody else is very upset about how he has done it, but that's Trump, right? So we wouldn't expect anything lesser. Anything lesser would have been like, that's all. But that he just had to do this. You know, he went up to that, I think they call it the Rose Garden, right? So he goes to Rose Garden and says, look, you know, anything more would have been more windy. This place is too windy, so I just show you a placard, and this placard, you know, he never even, I don't think even Malaysia was mentioned. I remember when it came to ASEAN, it came to look, you know, wow, we've got Cambodia, we've got Vietnam, you know, look at what's happening in Vietnam. So that's all. And then Laos. Suppose these were all the big numbers, because Laos gets 49 and Cambodia, Vietnam gets 46, 47, thereabouts. Comes to Malaysia, we are at 24%. Now, whether that's like something out of the world, first thing, what I kind of noticed is that 47% so-called tariffs that we apparently impose on that, is that true?
Okay. Yeah, I just want both of you to jump in here. Since we are on the topic of ASEAN, we saw on that particular chart as well, Vietnam at 46%, Cambodia at 49% compared to Malaysia's 24%. Can ASEAN maintain a unified front when these differences are there, and how will it affect members within the ASEAN bloc?
Methodologically speaking, several countries have actually came up with a framework. In the case of Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, those who have been hit with a high taxation, they have actually extended the olive branch to the American administration. And Trump seems completely happy with all of that. In other words, these three countries are willing to embrace what is known as the zero trade framework. In other words, when American exports were to come to Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, or even Thailand, they are completely willing and happy to accept those American products without taxation at all. To Trump, for that first preliminary phase, that's considered a major victory. So within that context, if ASEAN has already managed to win him over through this kind of little gesture, then obviously that's one modality that the rest of the whole region can consider. But is it really in the national interest of each and every single member state of all the 10 ASEAN countries that form Southeast Asia? That's subject to further discussion.
And on the back of that, and what's ahead of us, how will Malaysia balance all of this as ASEAN chair?
So I think as far as ASEAN, like, since you can touch on that topic, I personally think that we really cannot give much and unified. We probably can put up a unified, say, look, let's negotiate. But when it comes to the granular details, we are so far off, because even looking at the numbers, right? So the CMLV countries get hardest hit, and then Singapore on the other hand gets near zero surplus. They get the basic 10.
10%.
So, and they have already reached out and says, look, we're not really going to retaliate to this, we'll reach out to that. Because everybody's problem with this tariff rates, they are not hard numbers, right? So our 47% is actually not 47%, because if you look at average of what Malaysia charges across a tariff band, regardless of whether it's automotive or whether it's agricultural product, our average, MITI has quoted this number even yesterday, to be only 5.6%. So where does our 47% come? So our 47% is apparently a calculation of everything which needs to do with non-tariff barriers, everything that is a problem. And if you really look at the annex of that document, at page 200 plus something, right, among all the countries, 200 plus enumerates 12 different pain points that US has pointed out, saying like that includes things like automotive, it includes our procurement systems, especially the government procurement systems. It really puts out and says, look, even your halal industry, your standards of halal in JAKIM seems to be higher than anybody else in the world, including the Arab world. So that's an issue with us. An issue with us about us importing automotive in terms of the tariffs that we charge or the taxes that we impose. Even in terms of liquor, there's 12 items, right?
Right.
But can we give a unified response? No. Malaysia has to take a part which is good for us. We will show stewardship in terms of ASEAN. I think PMX has come out very well saying, look, we will definitely put this up as an en bloc, and as the ASEAN chair, I think Datuk Sri Anwar will show stewardship. But when it comes to negotiating, I think everybody has taken their own viewpoints, and we will do it our way.
Everyone for their own,
Yes.
to an extent.
To a large extent, I think everyone is looking at nationalizing it, right? So that's what Trump also is saying, MAGA. Right.
Yeah, which is also what we've just learned, that there will be a group led by the Zafrul who will be visiting Washington to discuss perhaps some of this points of concern.
So it's in good hands, right?
In good hands, but for what we are hearing, that it was perhaps wrongly put down in terms of its number. Were the calculations correct? I mean, how do we make sense of this?
When you say calculation, which number are you referring to?
The 47.
24%.
Oh, the 24.
The
24 is half
24%.
of 47.
Yes.
I mean, or give or take.
Give
Yeah.
or take.
From what I could understand, the 47% was actually derived from the number of import into Malaysia versus the exports to the United States. Then the number was divided by 2, coming to 47%, which Trump, in his own words, reduced it to 24 as a matter of showing his seeming benevolence to Malaysia.
Right. And which was a formula that was applied across the board?
The former, the one where you divide the imports and the exports and then divide by 2,
So
arriving at 47%.
Correct.
And then he halved it to 24.
24%.
So that's what he said, right, in his Liberation Day speech. And looks, we are not doing that. We're just coming in terms of retaliation. But if you look at that calculation, right, they did show a very Greek-looking formula in terms of a very complicated algebra, and says, look, this is one. But actually, what it apparently meant was, this is what Bloomberg I kind of read, and says what they say is basically the trade balance. It is just the trade balance, and the whole world has got a trade imbalance with America, because America now currently The last number they have quoting is 1.3 trillion in terms of the trade balance, not in their favor, but the number published is about $1 trillion. So give or take, that number is right.
So one of you earlier called it a reset, and perhaps I could be brave
hard
enough to
reset,
say it's a hard global reset because it's affecting so many countries across the world. But let's look at some numbers, and these numbers are staggering. Up to 60 billion ringgit is lost in export revenue and a potential 1.7% dip in our GDP as well. So that's going to be affected for sure. Help us unpack or understand this effect and how this will really affect Malaysia's domestic economy, our job market, everyday people.
If we were to look at the latest situation right now, obviously the stock markets are not doing well all over the world. And to the degree that this trend continues to go downward, the fear, the loss of confidence will be so massive that what was supposedly a recession could actually lead into a depression. So within that context, in light of what I just said earlier, that Malaysia will not be as badly affected as before, and Singapore has also come to the same conclusion, that our neighboring countries, our trading partners will all be badly affected by all these slew of measures that have been introduced by the Trump administrations. To the degree that our neighbors are weak, then that will affect our economic performance too. But it will not be we will not be as badly affected as the rest of the region.
Could I be fair to say that both of you are fairly optimistic about the days ahead for Malaysia?
Optimistic, yes, but then we have got into a really uncharted territories. Yes, so there's no playbook, right? So that number just now you quoted, right? The 60 billion reduction, that's a back of the envelope calculation. So simple logic being, we kind of our GDP is 1.5 trillion. Our exports to US is in the region of about 200 billion ringgit. 200 billion ringgit. So based on what Prof said, right? So the argument about semiconductors are not in play. Even exceptions have been given to even pharmaceuticals, right? So pharmaceuticals are also on that exception list. Based on that, those exception lists, it's about give or take 23%, which means about 77% of the goods that we export is tariffed in terms of the 24%. So if we use simple arguments about how this has affected, say, China, even Trump 1.0, the kind of decreases demand by about 20% in terms of when it comes to steady state. So the calculation being, at the end of the day, we would lose out about 60 billion in terms of exports. 2/3 of our GDP is based on exports. So whatever GDP numbers that we quote, say 5% this year, 2/3 of it is about exports. So if we shave off $60 billion out of our 1.5 trillion in terms of our GDP, we probably end up resetting our GDP numbers by about 0.5 to 0.7. You add a multiplier to it in terms of how this whole supply chain is connected, we probably go down, worst case scenario, by 1 to 1.5%.
Worst case scenario, Prof, is
Bank Negara has also done a simulation to say we will not enter a recession.
So there is a surety on that front that there is no impending recession on the horizon as of now.
That's just like saying, look, your whole savings is not being wiped out, but we are in for hard times. That's very clear.
That's just like saying the weather. It's not going to rain, and then we had a storm today.
You're not going to flood,
yeah,
but it's going to pour.
Prof?
My view of it is that the government has been quite far-sighted in the sense that there are certain issues that are actually coming into prominence that have not been properly publicized to the media. So for instance, when Prime Minister Ishiba Shige of Japan met with Prime Minister Datuk Sri Anwar on the 10th of January, they actually explored the idea of introducing or mutually collaborating on what is known as non-radioactive rare earth element, which are in abundance in Malaysia, especially in the Perak area. To the degree we can actually launch that and let that take off, the calculation from the Ministry of International Trade and Industry or Ministry of Natural Resources is that we can actually add 1 trillion ringgit to our GDP.
It's an untapped area.
It's an untapped area. So irrespective of the headwinds that we are facing right now, if we actually put our mind and soul into getting this non-radioactive rare earth element separation off the ground, by working with the Japanese, Chinese, or whatnot, then it's an untapped resource revenue.
You could add one more thing, right? So some of the things like even so that's why Zafrul has got it all right in terms of they're looking at it line by line. So just now we mentioned semiconductors are excluded, pharmaceutical is excluded. So an extension of that, now we are actually starting to already talk to them and says, look, we export close to 37 billion ringgit in terms of our exports of medical devices alone. Medical devices at the moment is not exempted, but a good 13 billion ringgit of that goes to US, which is our largest export market. So if you even can mitigate that, so 60 billion loss, so if you mitigate just one single item, which is medical devices alone, we would have closed the gap by about 13 billion, which is about a quarter.
Okay.
So every line matters, and I suppose we are
meticulous
our
about
best
it.
hands in it, and I'm sure we will reach a comfortable position. And to me, this is nothing permanent. It is a permanent reset.
Which is where I was going to jump in to say, although it's not there, it's neither a short-term issue. It's an issue here that is going to forever change the landscape of the way trade and other areas are explored. But back to what you were saying, Prof, about untapped potential, doesn't this also then present an opportunity for us to really drive some of these sectors and be a market leader or be a steward at the front of line?
Well, within the context of what I just explained, so in the coming month, at the end of May, the ASEAN summit will have a new mechanism altogether. So it will have ASEAN, the 10 member states of Southeast Asia. You will also have 6 countries that form the Gulf Cooperation Council. The 6 are Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, and Oman, for the first time. And in addition to which, China will also come into the mix. And the representation of China will be in the form of Prime Minister Li Qiang. Even when we can actually get all 3 sides to work together, the very same formula can actually be replicated on Japan, on Korea. I'm referring specifically to the +1 formula. So as long as we are willing to be creative with our trading partners, and we have to keep in mind our trading partners are also subject to the same kind of pressures from the United States. In fact, President Donald Trump went on the air and said, friends and foes, everyone beware. You'll be tariffed accordingly, especially the friends. So we have a lot of friends that we can actually work hand in hand, shoulder to shoulder.
Just right. So that's just my thought on this is, while this is a good policy approach, but then the problems on the ground are very real. They're not something that we can wait. So even say Rare Earth comes on board, by the time it goes live and fills in this gap, it's a time.
It has a life cycle.
So that chronology still runs. So to me, for example, you asked just now, right, how many jobs on the line? I'll give you one simple example. The worst hit industry in this would be furnitures. Because our largest export market is actually the United States. And at the moment, we export close to 6 billion in terms of furniture exports. We've got 30,000 jobs that are expected to be lost. As we speak, now the goods that are already on board on a ship to heading towards America is already being like, look, we're probably not going to pay for this because we cannot pay for this tariff.
April 9th and everything comes into
every
play today.
export, future exports that is there, everything is on the line, which means you tend to lose 30,000 jobs. By the time we fill in the gap, we've already, the ship would have sailed in this case. So to a large extent, government must step in. What is it that they'll need to do for those specific industries hardest hit? I think MITI is already looking at it, and PM is chairing a meeting on Monday. They call it the National Geopolitical Economic Task Force or some it's like a management group command center where they are actually putting together and says, what is it that we can do now to make sure those industries don't go down? Because by the time 6 months, this whole furniture industry is where we built in so many years of supply chain experience and expertise will just be wiped out overnight.
A.T. And Prof, Does this present us an opportunity or a point to ponder if we should not have so much resilience on the US? There is Africa there. There's also the opportunity to work with the larger
Yes.
BRICS and Middle East, as some of the
that's the thing.
countries
Only
you've pointed out.
13% is our export. So to a large extent, we are quite well diversified. So we are ready to take that shock. That's one of the reasons why we are probably not as bad as some of those other countries where they are highly reliant on the US export markets. We, on the other hand, have got good partners. Our market accesses towards other countries. Now we have got ASEAN GCC coming on board. So we will have other export markets which will probably have us in the medium term help fill this void.
How do you weigh in, Prof?
Well, the good thing about all this controversy right now is that it's generating or coming only from one source. In other words, you don't have Washington, D.C. pairing up with the European Union to corner Malaysia or ASEAN or Asia. You just have one person in particular who has been the one that has been ruffling the whole commercial scene to the degree that he can actually pull back from some of his actions so far. And some of his friends and buddies from the top 1% in the United States have actually shown some degree of fear that if he were to keep doing it, what is most feared, which is a recession leading to a depression, might actually come true. They have been trying to rein him in and hold him back. There's always that likelihood that peer pressure, whether we like it or not, might actually work. So what we are actually looking at right now is a day-to-day evolution of the dynamics in the mind of the man who is actually triggering all the fiasco himself, which is Donald Trump.
So do we...
Hour to hour, I would
Hour
probably
to
add,
hour,
right?
as
So
we see the news
as
coming,
we speak, right?
there
Yes.
is
So even
changes.
for China, it's no more the 34%. It was already the earlier 24,
But there's also
20, now it's 54.
Correct.
And then he said, look, by noon America time, another 50%, which means now they are at 104.
104%.
Which primarily says it's going to cost you twice of what it cost you last week, which simply means anything that's coming out of China, no go.
Right. Looking ahead, do we believe that this moment will serve as a turning point? Do we need to take a look at our books, a check and balance to really observe where Malaysia is headed?
We should look at it as a turning point strictly because this scenario has happened before in 1930, when the introduction of the Smoot-Hawley Act by the Congress actually deepened a recession into a serious structural depression. And it was not ended until President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was actually elected into office. And his approach then was huge fiscal stimulus, an economic approach that was also aided and abetted by the economic theory of John Maynard Keynes. Having said that, I would also like to concur with what Datuk Kumar said earlier. In the long term, this is what John Maynard Keynes said, in the long term everyone is dead. Because economic solutions have to be immediate and have to be prompt.
Right.
So what Datuk Kumar has echoed earlier is the fear that the government may not understand the severity and the urgency of the economic problem as quickly as the common people or even the businessmen on the ground. To the degree that the government has that kind of dexterity and willingness to listen to the business sector,
Right.
then more likely than not, we will be able to weather it.
But in that case, they're listening. I must say that this time around, or at least usually, simply because I think we have also been blessed in that way. We had a good COVID thing. And why MITI? Why Zafrul in that sense? I think simply because they have the institutional memory of doing this right. So they managed
Fresh in the
COVID
mind.
well. Yeah,
Right.
it's because of a virus, now it's because of Trump. But end of the day, I think we will be able to mitigate and navigate through this storm. We're in good hands. We have got trade divergent policies in place. We're talking to newer market accessors. I think this challenge will also present as an opportunity for us to do some resetting and recalibration and setting the sails in terms of how we are going to move forward. To a large extent, we will come out
Better and stronger out of this.
out of this, not necessarily better. We may have some losses, but we will definitely come out stronger.
Gentlemen, I want to thank you for coming in here and sharing your thoughts. As global trade dynamics continue to evolve by the minute, Malaysia finds itself at a critical juncture, balancing national interests with regional leadership under ASEAN. Now, the US tariff decision isn't just about economics. It's a reminder of how deeply geopolitics shapes the world that we operate in. Once again, thanks to our guests for their thought-provoking perspectives. I'm Jessie Chahal. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time with more in-depth conversations on topics that matter.